cabin was supposed to be an escape. I had been working nonstop for months, and my body and mind were begging for a break. A friend suggested a cabin deep in the woods, quiet, isolated, the perfect place to unwind. I thought it sounded ideal. A weekend with no phones, no emails, and no one else around. Just me, nature, and my thoughts. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It was beautiful, a small, rustic structure with a wraparound porch and a view of endless trees. The air smelled fresh, the kind of crisp scent that only comes from being far from civilization. I unloaded my car, carried my bags inside, and started to settle in. The interior was simple, a cozy living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and one bedroom. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though there was something old about the place. It wasn't run down, just aged, like it held memories. I brushed the thought aside, lit a fire, and made myself a quick dinner. By the time I finished eating, the sun had disappeared behind the trees, and the forest outside was cloaked in darkness. That was when I first heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, so soft I thought I was imagining it. A low, indistinct murmuring that seemed to come from outside. I paused, holding my breath to listen. It stopped. Must be the wind, I told myself, though the air outside was still. I shook it off and went to bed, eager to start my relaxation weekend. But the whispering came back. I woke up sometime after midnight, heart pounding. Something had startled me awake, though I couldn't say what. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. Faint, barely audible, but undeniably there, voices whispering my name. Lila. The sound sent chills crawling up my spine. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more clearly. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Lila, come outside. My stomach twisted. I knew I should stay in bed, ignore the voices, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and tiptoed to the window. Peering through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone outside. I turned off the flashlight and pressed my ear to the window. The whispers were still there, coming from the woods. Lila were waiting. My breath hitched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there watching me. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one before returning to bed. It took hours for me to fall asleep, and when I did, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures lurking in the trees. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe the isolation was playing tricks on me. I spent the day hiking the trails around the cabin, trying to distract myself. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the leaves, birds singing in the distance. For a while, I almost forgot about the whispers. But as the sun began to set, I started to feel uneasy. The shadows stretched longer, and the air grew heavy. By the time I got back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. Lila, come outside. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets tightly. I refused to move, refused to look. But the voices didn't stop. Lila, we see you. A loud knock on the window made me scream. My flashlight was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, shining the beam toward the window. There was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to pack up and leave, cut the trip short. But as I stepped outside to load my car, I stopped dead in my tracks. The ground around the cabin was covered in small wooden figures. They were crude carvings, each one shaped like a person. Some were missing limbs, others had exaggerated features, but they all had one thing in common: they looked like me. The hair, the clothes, even the way I stood. I felt sick. My legs wobbled beneath me as I stepped closer to one of the figures. The details were uncanny. How had someone made these without me noticing? I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me. Lila. The whisper was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the figures, scattered across the ground. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, bolting the windows for good measure. My phone had no signal, but I tried calling for help anyway. Nothing. The whispers grew louder as the day went on, filling the cabin like a chorus of voices. They were relentless, repeating my name over and over, urging me to come outside. By By nightfall, I was a wreck. My head throbbed, my nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was losing my mind. The whispering was constant now, a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I didn't dare look outside, but I could feel them out there, watching, waiting. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to find the wooden figures were gone. The ground was clear, as if they had never been there at all. I didn't waste any time. I threw my bags into the car and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from the cabin. Even now, back in the safety of my home, I can still hear the whispers sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet, they come back. Lila, we're waiting. I don't know who or what they were, but I know this. I'll never go back to that cabin in the woods. I rented the cabin for a weekend of peace and quiet. Life had been overwhelming lately, and I needed to get away from everything: work, people, and the endless noise of the city. The cabin, tucked deep in the woods, promised solitude. I arrived late in the afternoon. The trees surrounding the cabin were tall and dense, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. The structure itself was small but charming, with wooden walls and a stone chimney. The owner had left the key in a small lockbox near the door, just as promised. Inside, it was cozy: one large room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a small bedroom off to the side. The cabin was rustic but clean, with a stack of wood ready by the fireplace and thick blankets folded neatly on the couch. It felt like the perfect escape. After unpacking, I made myself some tea and settled on the couch with a book. The forest outside was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. As the sun set, the shadows in the cabin grew longer, and the silence started to feel a little heavy. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I wasn't used to this kind of stillness. I decided to call it a night. The first night passed without incident. I slept well and woke up feeling refreshed. After breakfast, I went for a long walk through the woods. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest was beautiful in the daylight. I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. A book was lying on the floor near the couch. I didn't remember leaving it there. It wasn't the book I had been reading the night before. It was old, with a worn leather cover and yellowed pages. Curious, I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting, messy and uneven. It looked like a journal. The first entry read, "I've been here for 3 days now. I thought this place would be peaceful, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. Sometimes I hear noises at night, footsteps, whispers. I keep telling myself it's nothing, but I don't believe it." I felt a chill run down my spine. Who had written this? Was it a guest who had stayed here before me? Or something else? I flipped through the journal. Most of the entries were short, describing small, unsettling events. Strange noises, objects being moved, a sense of being watched. Then, toward the end, the tone changed. The writing became frantic, the words scrawled across the page in uneven lines. "They know I'm here. They're watching me. I can't leave. They won't let me leave." The final entry was just one word, repeated over and over: "Help." I closed the journal and set it on the table, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a story, I told myself. Someone trying to scare future guests. Maybe it was even left there on purpose, part of some weird joke. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I heard footsteps. It started just after midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a faint creak coming from the living room. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then it came again. Another creak, louder this time. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was unmistakable now, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the wooden floor. My heart raced. Someone was in the cabin. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, holding it tightly as I crept out of the bedroom. The living room was empty, the front door locked. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. I checked every corner of the cabin, even the small bathroom and the closet. There was no one there. But as I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The journal, which I had left on the table, was now lying on the floor. The next day, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe I had knocked the journal off the table without realizing it. Maybe the footsteps were just the cabin settling. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I spent the day outside, hiking farther into the woods to avoid being inside the cabin. The The forest felt safer somehow, even with its eerie silence. When I returned in the late afternoon, I found something new waiting for me. The journal was open on the table, turned to a blank page. But it wasn't blank anymore. Scrawled across the page, in the same messy handwriting as the earlier entries, was a single sentence. "Don't look upstairs." A chill swept through me. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. Upstairs? There was no upstairs. The cabin was a single-story structure. Unless, my eyes moved to the ceiling. There it was, almost invisible in the dim light, a trapdoor leading to an attic. I hadn't noticed it before, and now I wished I hadn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept staring at the trapdoor, half expecting it to open on its own. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, heavier. They moved across the living room and stopped directly below the trapdoor. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The cabin was silent again, but I could feel something. Someone, standing just out of sight. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Then slowly, the trapdoor began to creak open. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. A face appeared in the opening, pale and ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, it said, "Help me." I don't remember much of what happened after that. Somehow, I found the strength to run. I grabbed my car keys and bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until I was miles down the road. The owner seemed surprised when I called to tell him I was leaving early. He didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. I don't know who or what was in that cabin, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back. Even now, weeks later, I can't get the face out of my mind. Those hollow eyes, the desperate whisper. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear it. Help me. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from the city and its constant noise. I needed this break. Life had become overwhelming, and I wanted nothing more than to spend a few days alone in nature. The cabin seemed perfect, simple, quiet, and surrounded by tall trees that swayed gently in the wind. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how peaceful it was. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction, the kind of place where you could lose yourself for hours. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with wooden walls, a fireplace, and large windows that let in the golden glow of the late afternoon sun. I carried my bags inside and started to explore. The living room was inviting, with a plush couch and a stack of firewood ready for use. The kitchen was tiny but functional, with an old-fashioned stove and a table for two. The bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a small dresser. Everything felt right, except for the door. It was in the basement. I found it while looking around after settling in. The basement was small and dimly lit, with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There wasn't much down there, just a few shelves with some tools, a dusty old chair, and that door. It was red, bright, and glossy, standing out against the gray concrete walls. Unlike the rest of the cabin, which felt rustic and natural, the door looked almost new. It had a sturdy padlock hanging from a metal latch, and there was no key in sight. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just storage, I told myself. Still, there was something unsettling about it. The door didn't belong in a place like this. I went back upstairs, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It was probably nothing, just my overactive imagination. I lit a fire in the fireplace, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on the couch with a book. The cabin was warm and inviting, and soon, I had almost forgotten about the red door. But that night, I heard the growling. It started just as I was drifting off to sleep. A low, guttural sound, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was an animal outside. Bears or coyotes, maybe. But as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. The sound was coming from below, from the basement. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The growling was steady, rhythmic, almost like it was breathing. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept to the basement door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The growling grew louder with each step, echoing off the cold concrete walls. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The red door was shaking. It wasn't a violent shaking, more like a steady vibration, as if something behind it was pushing against it, testing the lock. The growling grew louder, almost like a warning. I stood there, paralyzed with fear. My flashlight beam trembled as I shone it on the door. I wanted to run, to go back upstairs and pretend I hadn't seen or heard anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door, my hands trembling. The padlock was still secure, but the door itself seemed to pulse, almost like it was alive. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The growling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud thud shook the door, making me stumble back. I ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with questions. What was behind that door? The next day, I tried to act like everything was normal. I went for a hike, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The forest was quiet and serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The padlock on the red door was gone. I didn't want to go back into the basement, but I had to know what was happening. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I descended the stairs once more. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. The growling was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. Every instinct told me to leave, to run, but I couldn't turn away. Slowly, I pushed the door open. Beyond the door was a tunnel, long and dark, stretching farther than my flashlight could reach. The walls were made of rough stone, damp and cold to the touch. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the chilly air. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning like a labyrinth. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I don't know how long I walked before I saw it, an alcove carved into the stone wall. Inside was a small wooden box, old and weathered. I opened the box, and inside was a collection of photographs. They were pictures of people, men, women, children, all standing in front of the cabin. Some of the photos were recent, while others looked decades old. The faces were smiling, but their eyes looked hollow, almost lifeless. At the bottom of the box was a single note, written in shaky handwriting. "Don't trust the door. It doesn't lead out." I ran back to the cabin, my mind racing. Who were the people in the photos? And what did the note mean? That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. Around midnight, I heard the growling again. This time, it was louder, deeper, and it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from outside. I peeked through the window and saw shadows moving among the trees. They weren't animals. They were tall, lanky figures, their limbs too long, their movements too jerky. One of them stopped and turned toward the cabin. Even in the darkness, I could see its face, or lack of one. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface where its features should have been. It began to move toward the cabin, its long fingers clawing at the air. I ran to the basement, my only thought being to hide. The red door was still open, the tunnel stretching out before me. Without thinking, I stepped inside and slammed the door shut behind me. I don't know how long I wandered in the tunnel. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker. Eventually, I came to another door, identical to the first one. When I opened it, I was back in the cabin. Everything looked the same, the furniture, the fireplace, even my bags sitting by the door. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The shadows seemed darker, the silence louder. And then I saw them. The figures were standing outside the windows, their pale faces pressed against the glass. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stared. I don't know how I escaped. The next thing I remember, I was in my car, speeding down the dirt road. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know what was behind the red door, or where the tunnel really led. But sometimes late at night, I hear the growling again, and I wonder if I ever really left. The cabin was a dream come true. After years of saving and planning, I had finally purchased a small, secluded getaway deep in the woods. It was perfect, a place to escape the noise of the city and unwind in peace. The day I moved in was bright and sunny, the forest alive with birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, warm wooden walls, and big windows that let in plenty of natural light. It felt like home the moment I walked in. But there was one odd thing. The previous owner had left in a hurry. The furniture was still there, covered with white sheets, and boxes of random belongings were stacked in the corners. When I asked the realtor about it, she shrugged and said, "He didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to sell quickly." At the time, I didn't think much of it. People move for all kinds of reasons. I figured he had his own issues to deal with and was glad to leave. I spent the first day cleaning and unpacking, humming to myself as I worked. By evening, the cabin looked cozy and inviting. I lit a fire, made a cup of tea, and settled into the old armchair near the hearth. That's when I heard it, the voice. At first, I thought it was the wind. The sound was faint, like a whisper carried through the walls. I tilted my head, listening. "Hello." It was so soft, I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked around the cabin, trying to find the source. The voice came again, louder this time. "Is someone there?" It was coming from the wall near the fireplace. I pressed my ear to the wood, my breath shallow. The voice was faint but clear, a woman's voice, trembling and desperate. "Please help me." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of joke, right? Maybe the previous owner had installed some weird speaker system as a prank. But the voice didn't sound like a recording. It sounded real. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I heard her again, calling out from the walls. "Don't leave me here. Why won't you help me?" I told myself it was just the stress of the move, my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I searched every inch of the cabin, looking for speakers or hidden devices that could explain the voice. I even checked outside, walking around the perimeter of the cabin to see if there was anything unusual. Nothing. The walls were solid wood, the kind that wouldn't hide wires or speakers. There were no vents or ducts where sound could travel. It didn't make sense. As the day went on, I tried to ignore the voice, but it was relentless. It spoke in whispers and sobs, begging for help, pleading for me to listen. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer and chisel and started prying at the wall near the fireplace. The wood came away in chunks, revealing old insulation and the studs beneath. At first, there was nothing unusual, just layers of dust and cobwebs. But then, as I pulled away another piece of wood, I saw it, a small compartment built into the wall. Inside was a bundle of cloth, tied tightly with string. My hands shook as I pulled it out and untied the knot. The cloth fell away, revealing a small notebook and a locket. The notebook was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting inside was neat but rushed, as if written in a hurry. "If you're reading this, please help me. My name is Eleanor. I've been trapped here for so long, I don't know how much time has passed. He won't let me leave. He says the cabin belongs to him, and so do I." My breath caught in my throat. "I've tried to escape, but he always finds me. He whispers through the walls, watches me through the windows. I can't hide from him. If you find this, please don't ignore it. Burn the cabin. Destroy it. It's the only way to end this." The rest of the notebook was filled with frantic scribbles, words scrawled over each other. Trapped. Watched. Burn it. I opened the locket. Inside was a small photograph of a young woman with dark hair and sad eyes. Her face was familiar. It was the face I had imagined when I heard the voice. That night, the whispers changed. They weren't pleading anymore. They were angry. "Why did you open it? You shouldn't have found it. Now you can't leave." The voice echoed through the cabin, louder than before, filling every corner of the small space. I tried to ignore it, huddling under the blankets like a child, but the voice wouldn't stop. "You should have listened. Now it's too late." I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke to the sound of something scratching at the walls. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. The fire in the hearth had burned out, leaving the cabin cold and dark. I reached for my flashlight, but the beam only revealed more shadows. The scratching grew louder, closer. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I saw it. A face pressed against the window, pale and distorted. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was twisted into a horrible grin. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me. I froze, unable to look away. The thing outside raised a hand and tapped on the glass, its nails clicking softly. And then, in a voice that sounded like Eleanor's but wasn't, it whispered, "Let me in." I don't remember how I got through the night. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the whispers stopped, and the figure was gone. I packed my things as quickly as I could, throwing everything into the car without caring if I forgot something. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The front door was open, swinging gently in the breeze. And in the doorway, I saw her. Eleanor stood there, her sad eyes watching me. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just watched as I drove away. I never went back to that cabin. I told the realtor to sell it, to give it to someone else. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to forget. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the voice. It whispers through the walls of my apartment, soft and pleading. Help me. Don't leave me here. I don't know if it's Eleanor or the thing that kept her trapped. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to the woods. I had always wanted a break from the chaos of my life. The noise, the pressure, the constant rush. It was exhausting. So, when I found a small, isolated cabin in the woods, I couldn't resist. It was the perfect place to recharge, to clear my mind and reconnect with nature. The cabin was a quaint little building, tucked away in the heart of a dense forest. It was old but well kept, with a wooden exterior that blended seamlessly with the trees around it. There was a small porch with a couple of chairs, a stone fireplace in the living room, and a cozy loft upstairs. It was small, simple, and had everything I needed for a peaceful stay. I arrived in the late afternoon, and the air smelled fresh and crisp. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the trees. I unloaded my bags, set up a fire in the hearth, and made myself a cup of tea. The cabin felt like the perfect escape. I spent the first evening just relaxing, reading a book by the fire, and enjoying the peace and quiet. There was no rush, no deadlines, no distractions. It was exactly what I needed. But then, on my second day, I found the mirror. It was in the upstairs loft, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. At first, I thought it was just another piece of forgotten furniture. But when I pulled it out from the corner, I realized it was something else entirely. The mirror was large, with a heavy, ornate frame made of dark wood. It looked ancient, like it had been sitting there for decades, maybe longer. The glass was cloudy and scratched, the surface rippling slightly as I stared into it. I wasn't sure why, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I considered leaving it there, but then I thought, why not clean it up? After all, it was a beautiful piece, and it could add a nice touch to the cabin. I carefully moved it into the living room, propping it up against the wall. As I wiped the dust from the glass, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. The reflection in the mirror seemed off, like it wasn't quite right. The cabin behind me looked slightly distorted, the colors swirling in a way that didn't make sense. Shaking it off as just my imagination, I hung the mirror on the wall above the fireplace and went about my day. That night, as I sat by the fire, the unease I had felt earlier began to return. It wasn't just the mirror. I was starting to feel like something wasn't right with the cabin itself. The air felt heavier, thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But when I glanced at the mirror, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The reflection wasn't showing the cabin as it was. It was like looking at a different version of the room, darker, colder, and more distorted. The walls seemed to bend in unnatural ways, and the shadows cast by the fire flickered and moved in odd patterns. I turned to look behind me, but everything in the room was normal. I rubbed my eyes and took a deep breath. I was just tired, that was all. I had been working too hard lately, and the isolation was starting to mess with my mind. I stood up, walked over to the mirror, and gave it one last look. The reflection of me was there, but it was different. My face seemed more pale, my eyes darker, and my expression off. It wasn't a reflection I recognized. I quickly turned away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to leave the room. I grabbed my coat, went outside, and took a walk in the woods to clear my head. The cold air helped, and after an hour or so, I felt a bit better. But as I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the image of the mirror. It was like it was calling to me, pulling me back. The next day, I tried to act normal. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the reflection was due to the old glass. I decided to stay busy, go for a hike, cook some meals, and enjoy the fresh air. But as night fell, I couldn't escape the feeling of unease. The cabin seemed darker, quieter. Even the trees outside looked like they were pressing in on me, their bare branches scratching against the windows. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, but I couldn't shake the pull of the mirror. I knew I shouldn't go near it, but I had to see it again. I reluctantly stood up and walked over to the wall. The reflection was waiting for me. This time, it was worse. In the mirror, I saw myself standing by the fire. But something wasn't right. I wasn't standing in the same spot. The reflection showed me farther into the room, closer to the door, as if I had moved without realizing it. I reached out to touch the mirror, my fingers trembling. When I did, I felt a jolt of cold that shot through my arm and into my chest. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing. I tried to step away, but my reflection didn't move. It was staring at me. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like the reflection was alive, like it was a separate entity that could see me and was waiting for something. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange thoughts that were clouding my mind. But when I looked again, the reflection had changed. Now my reflection was smiling, an eerie, unnatural grin that stretched across my face. My eyes were wide, too wide, and they gleamed with something that wasn't me. I stepped back, gasping for air. What was happening? Why was it doing this? The next few days were a blur of strange events. Every time I looked into the mirror, the reflection grew more and more distorted. It was like I was losing control of my own image, as if the mirror was showing me someone or something else. One morning, I woke up and found that the reflection in the mirror wasn't even mine at all. It was a figure, a tall, thin man with dark hair, standing in the same position I had been just moments before. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, packed up, and prepared to leave. I was done with the cabin, done with the mirror. But as I reached for the door, I stopped. The mirror was calling to me again, pulling me back into the room. I turned around, against my better judgment, and walked back to the mirror one last time. I don't know why I did it. I should have left. But something inside me needed to see what would happen. As I stared into the glass, my reflection grinned again, this time more widely than before. The figure in the mirror started to move, walking toward the edge of the frame, closer and closer to the glass. I backed away, but it didn't matter. The reflection reached out, its fingers pressing against the glass. I felt a cold, sharp pressure on my chest, as if the reflection was trying to pull me in. With all my strength, I slammed my hand against the mirror, shattering it into pieces. The room was silent, save for the sound of the glass crunching beneath my feet. I left the cabin that day and never looked back. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with what had happened. I don't know what the mirror was, or why it had such a hold on me. But I know one thing: I will never return to that cabin again, and I will never forget the reflection that wasn't mine. I had been looking for an escape for a long time. After months of stressful work, endless meetings, and the constant noise of the city, I needed to get away. The idea of a quiet, peaceful retreat in the woods sounded perfect. So, when I found a cabin that was available for rent, I didn't hesitate for a second. The place was deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The cabin itself was simple: wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a small loft. It was exactly what I needed, isolated and quiet. I could already imagine spending the weekend in front of the fire, reading, and letting my mind relax. I drove up on Friday afternoon, just as the sky began to cloud over. The weather was starting to change, but I didn't think much of it. A little rain wouldn't ruin my weekend. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. The air was fresh and clean, the trees tall and ancient. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds. The perfect place to unwind. The cabin was just as I imagined, charming and cozy. The firewood was stacked neatly by the door, and the inside was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen, a large dining table, and a comfy couch by the fireplace. I immediately felt at home. I started a fire, unpacked my things, and made myself a cup of tea. As the evening wore on, I settled into the cabin's cozy atmosphere. The storm outside began to pick up, with the wind howling through the trees and rain hitting the roof with a soft patter. I didn't mind the storm. If anything, it added to the feeling of being completely cut off from the outside world. But as the night grew darker, something started to feel off. It began with a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it was something else. There was a soft thudding sound coming from somewhere inside the cabin. It wasn't a rhythmic sound like footsteps, but more like something tapping on the walls. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The cabin was old, and the wood creaked and groaned in the wind. But then, the sound came again. This time, it was louder, more urgent, like something or someone was tapping desperately at the walls. I stood up from the couch, my heart racing. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Just the sound of rain hitting the windows and the howling wind. I walked around the cabin, checking every room. Everything was quiet still. The cabin was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. I returned to the living room and sat down, my mind racing. The tapping had stopped again, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself down. It was probably just the storm, the wind playing tricks on the old house. I made another cup of tea and sat back down, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled over me. The storm raged outside, but it wasn't just the storm that made me uneasy. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't the tapping anymore. It was something worse. Every time I glanced around the room, I felt like I was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, and the firelight flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I stood up again and checked all the windows. Everything was locked, secure. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was outside. I even stepped outside onto the porch for a moment, the cold air hitting my face, but the storm had picked up even more. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain poured down in sheets. Nothing seemed out of place. I returned inside, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the book was a blur in my hands. And then I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper. It wasn't coming from the walls, though. It was coming from outside the cabin. I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain. The storm outside was wild, the trees whipping in the wind. But there, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. I gasped, my heart skipping a beat. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. They were standing still, staring at the cabin. But it was impossible to make out any details, just a vague silhouette in the storm. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The wind slammed against me, and the rain soaked me in an instant, but I pushed forward, shining the beam of light into the darkness. The figure was gone. I searched the area around the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the rain and darkness, but I found nothing. No sign of a person, no footprints, nothing. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Maybe it was just a trick of the storm. I returned inside, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking. I couldn't understand what had just happened. But one thing was certain, I wasn't alone. The storm continued through the night, but the tapping sound never returned. The figure outside was gone, and for a brief moment, I felt like I could relax again. But then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a loud bang coming from the attic. I jumped up, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight again, my mind racing. What was that? I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the attic door. The cabin felt colder now, the air thick with tension. I didn't want to go up there, but I had to know what was making the noise. With a deep breath, I opened the door and climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. The light flickered as I reached the top, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the room, looking for anything unusual. At first, everything seemed normal, old furniture, boxes, and some dusty items left behind by the previous owner. But then, I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the attic, there was a large wooden chest. It hadn't been there when I first arrived. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. The chest was old, covered in dust and cobwebs. The hinges were rusty, but it looked like it had been opened recently. I reached out, my hand trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside, there was a pile of old clothes, but beneath them, something else, something that made my stomach turn. A hand, a severed hand, pale and lifeless, resting at the bottom of the chest. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The room spun around me as panic set in. What had I found? Why was it here? I ran down the stairs, not looking back, and slammed the attic door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my body trembling with fear. I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. I grabbed my things in a panic, my hands shaking as I tried to gather my belongings. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to leave. As I rushed out the door and into my car, the storm raged on, the wind howling like some monstrous creature in the night. I didn't look back as I drove away, the cabin disappearing behind me in the rain and darkness. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. I didn't know what was real anymore, what I had imagined, and what had actually happened. But one thing was certain, I would never go back to that cabin in the storm. The forest, the cabin, the hand in the chest, it was all too much. I had to leave it behind, and I never looked back. I had always wanted to spend some time in a remote cabin, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. After months of stressful work and endless commitments, I decided it was time for a break. A weekend in a cabin by a lake deep in the woods, just me, the peaceful nature, and no distractions. I rented the cabin through a website and got everything arranged. I had no idea what I was walking into. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, and the drive out there was as peaceful as I had imagined. The road became smaller as I got farther away from civilization, winding through thick trees and up small hills. The landscape was beautiful, and everything felt quiet and calm. As I approached the cabin, it stood alone beside the lake, surrounded by tall trees and a few shrubs. The lake itself was a deep shade of blue, its surface still and untouched. The cabin looked old, but charming, just what I had hoped for. It was a simple, rustic building made of wood with a stone chimney. There was a porch with a couple of chairs, and inside, everything looked exactly like what I imagined. A fireplace, a cozy sofa, a small kitchen, and a big window that looked out over the lake. After I unpacked my things, I made myself at home. I started a fire in the fireplace, unpacked a book I had been meaning to read, and enjoyed a warm cup of tea. The first few hours were perfect. The silence of the place was unlike anything I had experienced in a long time. But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere started to change. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. The stillness of the lake turned into an eerie quiet, as if something was waiting. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then I heard it. A soft sound, like a splash in the lake. I stood up, puzzled. I hadn't seen anyone around when I arrived, and there didn't seem to be any boats on the water. I looked out the window, but the lake was still. The surface was perfectly smooth. I tried to ignore it, thinking it must have been a fish or some other animal. But as the evening went on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Night fell, and the cabin became darker. The fire in the fireplace crackled, but the air inside felt heavy, as if something was lurking in the shadows. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange noises, scratching sounds on the walls, creaks from the floorboards, and the faintest whispers on the wind. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, the wind, or some animal outside. But the longer I lay there, the more unsettled I felt. The whispers were growing louder, almost like a conversation, but I couldn't understand what was being said. My heart raced as I tried to shake off the feeling. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. Who could it be? I was miles away from the nearest neighbor. I wasn't expecting anyone. Tentatively, I got out of bed and walked toward the door, my mind racing. As I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. What if it was someone playing a prank? Or something worse? But before I could even touch the handle, the knock came again, this time louder and more urgent. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. My breath felt like ice in my chest. Who would come all the way out here? Was I imagining things? I opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. The porch was empty, the darkness stretching out before me, the only sound the occasional rustle of the trees. I stepped outside, scanning the area, but there was nothing. I was alone. I locked the door and went back inside, my heart still pounding. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, maybe the wind or some other sound that had startled me. But then, just as I was about to settle down again, I heard it once more. A splash. It came from the lake. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds singing and the soft light of the rising sun coming through the window. The air was crisp and fresh, and for a brief moment, I thought that the strange happenings from the night before were nothing more than a bad dream. I decided to go for a walk around the lake to clear my head. The water was still, and the surrounding trees reflected perfectly on the surface. As I walked, I kept thinking about the strange noises. The knocks, the splash in the water, it didn't add up. I decided to take a closer look at the lake, maybe try to find out where the splash had come from. I walked along the shore, scanning the water, but I didn't see anything. That's when I noticed something strange, footprints in the mud near the edge of the lake. They were large, too large to be mine, and they seemed fresh. I stopped and stared at them. The footprints led from the water's edge, back into the woods. I had no idea who could have made them, but something about it made my skin crawl. I followed the trail for a little while, but it only seemed to go deeper into the woods. The further I walked, the more uncomfortable I felt. The trees were thick here, blocking out most of the light. The air grew heavier, and the quiet became unnerving. I felt like I was being watched. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling uneasy, but not wanting to admit it. I didn't want to be out here alone in the woods, following mysterious footprints. When I got back to the cabin, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But the unease didn't leave. The shadows seemed to be darker in the corners of the rooms, and the whispers from last night returned. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. I started the fire again and sat down, trying to distract myself with a book. But I couldn't focus. I kept hearing the whispers, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That night, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more persistent. It came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen window. I stood frozen, listening, my heart racing. The knocks were rhythmic now, almost like someone was trying to get my attention. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know what to do. Slowly, I walked toward the kitchen, trying to keep my steps quiet. When I reached the window, I hesitated. Should I look? What if there was someone out there? What if it was something worse? But curiosity got the best of me. I slowly pulled the curtain back. There was no one outside. But the footprints, those same large footprints, were visible in the dirt near the window. They led from the edge of the porch up to the cabin, but this time they stopped right at the kitchen window. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who had been out there? What did they want? I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't feel safe here anymore. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I had to leave. But as I packed up my things, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. I felt my heart skip a beat as I checked the rest of the cabin. Everything seemed untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I quickly finished packing and headed for the car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The drive back felt like an eternity, and I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I tried to put the experience out of my mind, but it lingered. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the footprints, the knock on the door, and the whispers. I never told anyone about what happened at that cabin. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that cabin by the lake. And I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful retreat. I had planned it for months, looking forward to the time away from the hustle of everyday life. A few days in a small cabin in the woods to escape, clear my mind, and relax. It had been a hectic few weeks, and I thought that the calm surroundings would help me reset. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town or any sign of civilization. It was an old, simple place, built from weathered wood and tucked in among the towering trees. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place that had been standing for decades, maybe longer. The windows were small, the roof steep, and there was a small porch with a rocking chair. I rented the cabin for the weekend. No cell service, no internet, just me and the nature around me. The drive there had been peaceful, with only the occasional car passing by on the winding, narrow roads. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was exactly what I needed. The inside of the cabin was just as simple, nothing fancy, but comfortable. A fireplace stood at one end of the living room, and a few old chairs were arranged around it. There was a small kitchen with just the basics, a stove, a refrigerator, a sink. Upstairs, there was a loft with a bed and a small window that looked out over the forest. I was excited to spend the evening by the fire, reading a book and sipping a hot cup of tea. The first few hours were perfect. The only sound I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees outside. It was calm, peaceful, exactly what I had been hoping for. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It began subtly, almost like a shift in the air around me. At first, I didn't notice it. I was too absorbed in my book, enjoying the quiet, the warmth of the fire. But then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the space around me had changed. The room felt darker, despite the light from the fire. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out unnaturally. I shook my head and tried to dismiss the feeling. It was just the isolation, the silence, making my mind play tricks on me. Then I heard it, a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind outside. Maybe the trees were swaying against the cabin, making strange sounds. But as the whispering continued, I realized it was coming from somewhere inside the house. I froze. My heart raced, and my breath caught in my throat. The whisper was too soft to make out, but it was definitely there. I stood up and walked around the cabin, checking every room, but there was no one else there. The whispering stopped for a moment, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But then it started again, this time closer, right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. No response. Just silence, followed by the soft crackling of the fire. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I hearing things? Was I imagining it? It was so easy to convince myself that it was nothing, just the cabin settling, the wind playing tricks on me. But the whispers seemed too clear to ignore. I decided to go outside for a moment. I needed some fresh air to clear my head. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the silence had gotten to me. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hit me, and I took a deep breath. The storm clouds that had been gathering earlier were now overhead, blocking out the stars. It was dark, almost too dark. The only light was the soft glow from the cabin's windows. The woods around me were silent, too silent. Not a single animal made a sound. The only thing I could hear was the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden structure. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself, before I turned to go back inside. But as I reached for the door, I heard something behind me. A movement. I spun around, my heart racing. There was nothing there, just the trees stretching out into the darkness. But then I saw something, just for a second. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, and for a moment, I thought I saw a faint shape moving toward the cabin. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I quickly stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The whispers continued off and on, always just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes they sounded like words, sometimes like distant laughter, but each time they were followed by a feeling of dread, like something was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. I even turned on the TV, though there was no signal. The soft static made the room feel colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with every passing minute. At some point, I drifted off to sleep on the couch, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me to fall asleep. The next day, I decided to go for a hike in the woods. Maybe getting out into the open air would help clear my mind. The sun was out, and the storm clouds had moved on, leaving only the occasional cloud in the sky. The air was fresh, and the sound of birds filled the air. But as I walked deeper into the forest, I started to feel uneasy again. The trees were thicker here, blocking out much of the sunlight, and the path seemed to wind in strange ways. It was like I was walking in circles, though I was certain I hadn't passed this spot before. I stopped and looked around. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind seemed to have died down. That's when I saw it. A shadow, moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, but a person, tall,